It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Smith. She's the founder and engineer of Side Nerd Apps, which is intuitive software that empowers businesses to do big things like improve employee engagement, lead collection, and enrichment. And give it up for Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to share how predictive AI can translate input into insight. So this is going to be somewhat of a personal story. I'm going to share about how my experiences brought me from somebody doing the translation to automating and kind of defining the architecture. So a little bit about me, starting at the beginning. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and one thing to note is when I was a kid, I loved math and I really hated Spanish. And at one point, I tried to negotiate with my guidance counselor for more math and less Spanish. And I'd say fortunately, he said no. Had to keep going with the Spanish, and in practice, I've used my terrible Spanish way more than my really good calculus. When I started at UVA in economics, I learned about a new type of translation that I could translate human, messy, environmental data into equations, which I thought was awesome. So, as I was mentioning, Spanish has been more useful than math. Is my family on a couple of trips, scuba diving with my little brother in Mexico and Ecuador with my family. You'll get to know them a little bit better too. So, let's step forward a couple of years, and I'm having my first kind of super professional job at Analytic Partners, which, if you don't know, is a media mix modeling agency. And media mix modeling is a type of regression analysis, typically regression, that determines the drivers of sales. And when you're starting as a new junior analyst at Analytic Partners, your job is this. We are a white glove service, which means our clients can share the data in any format they like, and the new analyst has to clean it and get it into the right format. So you might have something like a PDF of a media plan, and here you can see the first translation, that human environment into the structured data. For a media mix model, the structure is pretty simple. At its core, it's spend by channel by week, and of course the dependent variable, as well as some parameters that you can set. So first thing, we make that translation. Second, we got to take that structured data and turn it into an insight. And we're using machine learning, we're using regression methodology to do this. That's pretty typical. But the ROI as the insight is not enough. We're also going to do a third type of translation, and that is insight to decision. We're running scenarios, we're doing forecasts, and we're doing optimization planning. So ideally, the client can receive recommendations about how they should be spending, and of course, do decision to action. That fourth type of translation, where we're turning these numbers hopefully into some spend decisions. So us at Analytic Partners, it's not our responsibility to get in there and actually change the budget, but ideally the client is listening to our recommendations and turning those knobs and working towards a better ROI overall. So, again, introducing my little brother. He is fast gunning for the golden child role. He became a doctor recently, and to showcase this sort of knowledge as a service, step-by-step translation model in an example that our parents would care about and understand, we can think about it from the doctor role. And this is one of these roles that, like all of ours, people are really thinking about how to automate and how to automate in these different steps. So first we have the patient visit, that's the environment, the messy data. We're structuring that by extracting vitals and symptoms, which is really a schema of medical practices. And then we're comparing that schema, that extracted data to the norm, to the healthy person, identifying their deviation, turning that into a diagnosis, and hopefully, similar to Analytic Partners, hopefully that user or that patient is taking the medication, doing their treatment, and is going to get better. All right, so we can think about taking a step up and kind of each of those translation tasks being a step up in this pyramid from information collection to analysis, decision making, and execution. And when we're thinking about these two types of translation, what is core to that business model is typically going to be one of these translation types, which means if you do this badly, nobody's going to hire you to do the thing. And in kind of both medical as well as advanced analytics, this information analysis is of course core. It's in the name of analytic partners. All right, I wasn't the first person to think about these things in this sort of framework. In fact, in 2000, Paris Serman and friends released an article that identified the 4 types or stages of automation that naturally match the types that I identified as I was trying to break down my role at analytic partners and other kind of knowledge as a service organizations. And so it's the same thing: acquisition, analysis, decision, and finally implementation. And another really cool thing about this paper is that I identified particular risk factors associated with each different translation type, which we can use, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But before we go there, a little bit more about me. So I love analytics. I was having a great time learning and growing in these roles, but one thing that was lacking was meaning and purpose. It's incredibly important to feel fulfilled and a well-rounded person, and for me, what that meant was doing a lot of volunteer work. So in my 20s, I volunteered for a variety of organizations, and the most important to me was court-appointed special advocates. You are assigned a child or a sibling group in foster care, and you have to visit with the children, collect information from the medical practitioners, the educators, the social workers, really everybody who's involved in that child's life. And you have to do a lot of documentation. Ultimately, you're using these visits as data points to put together a court report and make recommendations about what is in the best interest of the children. So that was an incredibly important role, and I found that the worst part of this role was the tracking. We were required not only to track volunteer hours, but by type: training, travel, working on a report or admin versus actual contact, as well as additional metrics like the various touch points that we had, the dates they were, etc. And we had a paper form that we had to fill out every month. It was very tedious, and I wasn't the only one who kind of saw this as a black spot in an otherwise very rewarding volunteer experience. And I saw the same sort of thing at the other organizations I volunteered with. Each had a kind of terrible way of tracking. And me, I'm pretty tech savvy, I can figure them out. It's an app, it's a website, it's a username, it's a password, but a lot of my fellow volunteers really struggled with this translation task. Messy human environmental data about me doing some volunteer work into a defined schema that is going to help that nonprofit organization do grants and donor reports. And I thought, is this just me? So I reach out to my dad, who is also an avid volunteer. There he is at the South Carolina Aquarium teaching kids about ecology from underwater. And it turns out my dad has been a bad boy. He has not been tracking his volunteer hours, and his volunteer coordinator has recently sent him a very helpful 4-slide deck, 8-step instructional process about how to submit his hours. And my dad's not alone, he's not really doing this, and neither are his fellow volunteers, which is an issue. So I said, Dad, what if instead of all that, all you had to do was this? A simple text message to get all of the data that nonprofit needs to do grants, donor reports, etc. And he said, that I could probably do, and he became the first beta tester of the pilot product of Side Nerd Apps, ITHR for volunteer and donation tracking. So, the premise of the company overall is not just focused on volunteerism. You know that software you hate logging into, be it Salesforce or some other third-party platform? What if you didn't have to? What if a simple data entry or update task could be done via text? So I decided to focus in on this first type of translation, information collection. All right, so we've started to think about these things in sort of an architectural way, and what do architects need? Design principles. So I've identified some design principles that correspond to the particular risk factors of each of these translation types that I'm going to share with you. So first, the big risk factor is misinterpretation or ambiguity. You gotta combat this by adding structure to complexity, and I'll share some examples in later slide. Secondly, when you're doing that structured data into insight, as modelers in kind of traditional predictive AI, we know that false conclusions and statistical noise are our enemies. So we combat that by wrapping it in metadata and validation rules. Finally, misalignment with goals, not actually implementing the decision. So we need to think about making it callable and usable for the people, or eventually the AIs, that are going to be making these decisions. So these are the principles and the places and the types of automation or data transformation that you really need to think about applying them in. So let's talk about predictive AI. So when we think about these various stages, it's the first two that are the big opportunities for predictive AI. And we also have particular tools that really help with that particular design principle. So when you're thinking about human to structured data, fine-tuning is immensely helpful. I think it gets less credit because it is difficult and tedious to do. It's a little bit more expensive to run a fine-tune versus a regular model, but it lets you run a dumber model. It lets things happen faster, which is of course very important in real-time text message data entry. Second, if you're doing structured data to insight, that's the primary zone of our traditional predictive AI regression, modeling, and forecasts. And if this is the space you're in, you need to double down on metadata and validation. So let's talk about, in practice, applying these design principles based on my personal experience in media mix modeling as well as my own current company. All right, so what does fine-tuning teach a model? Custom labels and fields. When a user is texting in natural language, and I worked with users of multiple languages, of multiple intellectual capabilities, even some with disabilities of multiple ages, they're going to text about this stuff in different ways, and we don't even know the sort of nonsense that people are going to put in text. But we need to train the model to handle it, and by fine-tuning, by continuing to input different sorts of data types, examples of data extraction, we can create a really flexible, fast, and inexpensive way to parse the data in real time. So, without fine-tuning, think about that nonprofit example, CASA, also means house in Spanish. So without fine-tuning, without telling the model, even with just one example, that the cause is children, the org is CASA, it's not the topic, we're gonna get an accurate entry. If the user just puts in a 2, in my experience, that model is gonna wanna give you more than that one field. It's got a long prompt, it wants to do its work, but with just a couple of fine-tuning examples, it's gonna extract only what it needs to extract, it's not gonna add nonsense. And finally, one particular thing about text messaging is if you ever heart a message, what it comes through from a text standpoint is loved, the message. We don't want to be re-entering another thing, right? We need to interpret correctly that that is a feedback statement and feedback is positive. So again, a couple of fine-tuned examples and the model's not gonna make that mistake again. All right, so second, we need to think about metadata and validation rules. So here we're thinking about the media mix model and what we're applying. You need lineage, so I have examples in the later slide, transparency and diagnostics. Even a human may only be able to understand and interpret a couple of these sorts of diagnostic fields at a time. When we're starting to think about our AI agents or models making these sorts of decisions, they can interpret and use a lot more metrics. So how are we setting them up for success? And finally, decision safety checks. We know in media mix modeling that if the model outputs something nonsense like, okay, it's driving negative sales, we gotta go back to the start. We gotta figure something else out. So more specifically, you could think about the agency changing and that having an impact on the output, and it's so important for decisioning that we know that the data lineage changed and not some other factor so that we can make decisions. Transparency and diagnostics, I talked about that a little bit, R squared. We in the room know that that can be not a super useful metric to do, but it's important to surface, as well as the confidence intervals, etc. Again, so that we cannot misinterpret the results and we don't make bad decisions. And you need to flag recommendations, whether you're escalating it to another model or to revisit the inputs or to a human, you need those safety checks in place, and you need to use your domain knowledge to implement those safety checks in order to automate something as complex as a media mix model. All right, so the key takeaway of this talk is that by understanding the particular risk factors in each of these translation types and good methodology, best practices, or design principles as I've outlined, you're going to end up with an automated system, ideally a knowledge as a service business model that has the potential for profit and scale and service of your customers that's trustworthy, explainable, and reusable, and therefore a solid business versus one that maybe needs a little work. So that's what I have for you today. Any questions or thoughts, please connect with me on LinkedIn, but I am happy to take questions from the audience as well.
All right. Anyone have questions for Emily? We have 5 minutes. We have plenty of time, please. Yes.
Could you give an example what kind of a generative AI technique you have been used for the marketing mix modeling?
Generative AI in marketing mix modeling. So personally, I haven't. When I was kind of heavy into MMM, there really wasn't a lot of generative AI happening. It was a few years ago. But that said, some ideas for opportunities in that space are kind of using a generative AI that understands like what the priors might be in different scenarios and can transform maybe a natural language explanation of the business model and the focus into priors or into the defined data type. You could also potentially use it in that phase of messy human environment data into structured data by having a generative AI model do a lot of that work that me as a junior analyst had to do in terms of writing the transformation scripts in SQL or Python in order to extract the right data and get it into the structured format needed to run a media mix model.
Other questions? So I have a question. Oh, wait, it's okay.
You can ask yours too. Just wondered how a lot of times to implement, particularly in an easy model, you can have the machine gather the information. So rather than texting, here I am at, you could just have it a little app that sits in the background. Okay, when they're at the SCADA place, start the timer. When they leave the SCADA place, leave, do the timer. So they get automatic machine gathered model, or they take a picture and it pulls the time off of the picture. This was the time. These are the people they were visiting because you can see inside the picture.
Yeah.
Because for the older adults and for those who are having challenges filling forms, if the phone does it automatically for them, it makes it a whole lot easier.
Yeah. So I can see that there are like a lot of alternatives, and I think the only firm trying to kind of sell this sort of service in the structure and the way I am. And the reason that I've focused on text message is that it's so ubiquitous and so accessible for all. Even the understanding that it takes and the space on the phone, in fact, many of our users have accessibility issues with downloading another app because they have space issues on their phone. Talking to some clients in Africa where it's very common not to have a smartphone, but they can all text. So while the kind of model and system is flexible enough to input from a variety of sources, because nobody's really offering this text idea, and it's ubiquitous and user-friendly. Like everybody can text their grandkids. It's a contact in your phone versus an app that you might have to log in and download. I think there's still a space for the kind of unique offering that I'm providing here.
Okay, thank you. The question I was wondering is, are you imagining a layer that you're offering to current software like providers, or are you looking for a layer that you're providing that you're selling to the clients of certain softwares?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different business models that I'm testing. I'm really early in this. So we have 2 products I'm selling on a SaaS model, the volunteer tracker as well as a lead capture tracker. I've built them, I've designed them. The second business model I have is custom apps and systems for clients. So sometimes these are standalone systems, and this is what I've really done so far. I have a client who is doing Medicare lead collection and answering questions about Medicare. I have a client who's tracking hours for cardiac surgeons from a staffing agency to bill against different hospitals. So people come to me with this unique problem. What my hope is to build case studies and kind of work towards providing an API-first product that would serve as the natural language layer on top of an existing software platform. So the client would come and say, here's a couple of the workflows that people don't want to log in to do. can you add a SMS or even kind of more generally a natural language layer to give them a different option to interact with our backend, and the platform that I've built will definitely be able to step up and provide that service. And so I'm going to kind of see how all of these things kind of play out in the market and where the interest and attraction is, and focus accordingly. But the platform's flexible enough, and kind of I would love to start selling it as a layer kind of to that software company as a kind of improve engagement for their end users, and I think that's a really powerful idea.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you. Give her a round of applause.